Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another deck overview. This one that won the poll, that is Dimir Control. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. So this one is Dimir Control, the sister deck of the Esper and blue-white control decks that we've already kind of covered. Deck is very similar to blue-white in what it does, except it has slightly worse sweepers and slightly worse win cons versus slightly better spot removal that the deck has access to. Primarily the differences are things like the Wandering Emperor and Teferi Hero of Dominaria, and also having access to sweepers like Supreme Verdict and Farewell. Taking a look at an example of an Azorius control deck that's done well recently. As you can see, obviously the curve starts a little bit higher. You have access to things like Dovin's Veto and Absorb. Temporary Lockdown is a new card that's also kind of gotten in the mix along with Supreme Verdict. And you get to run things like the Wandering Emperor, Teferi Hero of Dominaria, in addition to your Shark Typhoons. Downside is you're running slightly worse removal, things like Portable Hole, Fateful Absence, March of Otherworldly Light. While they do answer some things that blue-black is simply not capable of answering, they are also a little bit either more mana costly or have a disadvantage, such as giving your opponent a clue token, etc. If you look at this slightly older blue-black control list, other versions lately have been primarily built around Bob the Dog, aka Gabriel Nassif's win from a Pioneer Preliminary recently, or a Pioneer Challenge deck that did well recently. Most of the lists have been kind of carbon copies of those two, so this is why we're kind of taking a look at a little bit older list, because they have a little bit different in what the deck is built. Obviously, you have access to Fatal Push, probably the best early removal spell in the game, especially if you can trigger Revolt with things like Field of Ruin and such. Being able to kill even up to a 4 mana cost creature for 1 mana, obviously very good. Eliminate, very good against dealing with early creatures and planeswalkers. Hence why I say this deck has access to the best removal spells. Soul Shatter allows you to deal with your opponent's most expensive planeswalker or creature. And then you do have some access to some sweepers, and they're solid. Extinction Event, obviously this is an exile-based effect, as in Shadow's Verdict, but they both have holes in them. Extinction Event, you can only choose even or odd. If your opponent happens to be playing something like Obosh or something, this isn't as big a deal. Or if your opponent's playing, an early aggressive deck like Mono Red or Mono White, Shadow's Verdict tends to clean up a lot of things and also happens to exile things from graveyards. Quite nice, but it is no damnation. Beyond that, you get to play things like Consider to help filter your draws, Make Disappear and Negate as counterspells. Obviously, you could run things like Censor or Jawari Disruption. Unfortunately, not being in the white colors, you don't get access to Absorb, but Sinister Sabotage does help to set up your draws. Memory Deluge is a little bit of card advantage, and then you kind of get into the top end here. Shark Typhoons as either a tap-out control win con, that once you untap with it, basically you're going to win the game, unless your opponent has some way to remove enchantments in their deck, such as any number of naturalized effects, or the 5 mana spell that Mono Black sometimes plays. Beyond that, Shark Typhoon, obviously, usually more of a win con at flash speed by using the cycling ability to draw cards, as well as to create a big shark, or potentially a small shark, just to start chipping away against decks like Lotus Field. Torrential Gearhulk obviously plays nicely with all these different instant speed things. Obviously your sweepers aren't instant speed, but the rest of your deck is pretty much instant speed. Then Hullbreaker Horror is a nice way to break the control mirror. As far as a land base, obviously being 2 colors, you get to run a bunch of utility lands. Hull the Storm Giant as a way to close out games in addition to your other creatures and Shark Typhoons. Field of Ruin to deal with your opponent's man lands or big threats such as Thespian Sage when your opponent tries to copy a Lotus Field, things like Nykthos, etc. Castle Vantress as a nice way to filter your draws as well when you're not doing anything else with your mana. Then you get to play a fairly clean 2-color mana base. Get to play some amount of basics, so you're a little bit immune to Field of Ruin yourself. And obviously 2 colors, you tend to have a fairly solid mana base overall. The newer variants, playing a few new cards. Mainly the new one from Dominaria United is Urte Resurrected. This is a flash creature that when it enters the battlefield, you can either counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. Its controller draws a card. Destroy target creature or planeswalker, its controller draws a card. So you get a 3/2 body, your opponent gets a card, you get to deal with their most annoying spell or threat. Seems like a pretty reasonable deal wrapped up in 4 mana. Guess going back to, we'll talk about the sideboard here in a minute. I forgot to check the sideboard of the other deck. But the positive of this version, kind of like Esper, you do get access to things like Thoughtseize, which improves the control mirror and also improves the various combo matchups, allowing you to kind of disrupt your opponent while also having some information about what spells they have to play against you. Newer versions are also playing one-of copy of Jace Vryn's Prodigy, which while this isn't great in the creature matchups, can be very difficult for your opponent to deal with in the control matchups, especially in post-board games. Forces them to lead in some awkward stuff that otherwise they wouldn't want to do. One-of Search for Azcanta. Obviously, this is a powerful enchantment that saw some play in Ixalan. It's kind of waned and waxed its placing in the format, as it is a little bit slow at what it does, but it does filter your draws and eventually gives you access to Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin, which allows you to find various different things in the mid to late game. Once again, another nice mana sink, and effectively gives you a 26 land. Power Word Kill. This kills most things in the format. Now, notably, there are some things it doesn't randomly kill. For instance, if your opponent's on Green White Angels, this doesn't kill anything other than the clerics in the deck. It does not kill Mayhem Devil or Devil tokens out of Ab Nixilis. So there are some things, and there are some dragons that see play. Sometimes you'll see Glorybringer or something. So this doesn't always kill everything, but for the most part, it kills most things in the format. Cavaliers, it kills anything out of mono red, etc. So, interesting card to be aware of. Sinister Sabotage, once again, kind of the best counterspell you have access to if you don't have access to Absorb. Narset, some of the versions also play Days Undoing as a combo. Otherwise, Narset's just kind of an impulse or two, and makes it more difficult for decks like Lotus Field combo, or decks that are trying to draw a bunch of cards. And then Sorin the Mirthless has been a Planeswalker that's been starting to see some play in these lists. It gives you bodies, it gives you card advantage, and the ultimate could potentially win you the game. Kalidas is a one-of, it's quite nice, especially against the aggressive decks. Sweepers we've already kind of talked about with Extinction Event. Memory Deluge we already kind of talked about. Dig Through Time is a one-of, quite nice. Now the one thing with these control decks, unlike something like Is It Phoenix, these decks don't do a great job of filling up their graveyard as efficiently. So you can't run as many Delve spells, can't run like Tremble Trespasses or multiple copies of Dig Through Time, or not Dig Through Time, Treasure Cruise. So instead you're forced to rely on Memory Deluge. But between Memory Deluge and Dig Through Time, you do see a lot of cards. And obviously, Shark Typhoon we've already kind of talked about. This version also gets to play a copy of Otawaru, runs a copy of Hull of Storm Giant and Hive of the Eye Tyrant, both of which are quite nice man lands. Gyro Reach Sanitarium is a nice utility land to have access to, be able to filter your draws a little bit at the downside of giving your opponent card selection, although if you're running Narset, you can potentially lock them out of ever drawing relevant cards other than instant speed stuff again. Sideboard, we'll take a look here quick at this list. Siphon Insight, quite a nice card. Do we look at the top two cards of your opponent's library? To exile one of them, you can cast it at any other time. Also has Flashback, has instant speeds. This is nice in kind of the grindier matchups. Meathook Massacre, when you need another sweeper, that's also very good against random things like Sacrifice and such, kind of buffering your life total a little bit. Shadow's Work, we've already kind of talked about. Kalidas, we've already kind of talked about. Thoughtseize and Duress as additional ways to disrupt your opponent, either if they're combo or control. Cling to Dust, when your opponent has any type of graveyard shenanigans going on. Blood Chief's Thirst, nice answers to planeswalkers and creatures, especially cheaper ones, but can be kicked to deal with any of them. Mystical Dispute for the control matchups, for Is It Phoenix, for Spirits. Disdainful Stroke for any type of big mana nonsense or the control mirrors. And then Ether Gust, very good against mono green and against things like mono red. Taking a look at the first list sideboard that we kind of forgot to discuss. Thought Distortion, very good in the control mirror, very good against Lotus Field. Shadow's Work, we already kind of talked about, as well as Kalidas. Path to Peril, nice sweeper that you have access to, although without the white mana in the deck, you're basically just sweeping up 2-mana creatures, which, is nice in matchups against such as humans and mono red. Liliana the Veil, kind of one of, interesting in a deck that has a bunch of counterspells, don't really like it very much, but, it can be relevant against decks that have some difficulty to deal with creatures, liking to edict them. Go Blank, pretty good against the attrition-based matchups, against combo. Cling to Dust, obviously good against creature decks. Summary Dismissal, this is a good way to get around things like Eldrazi and such. Can also deal with problematic triggers your opponents might have, while also having the ability to exile cards that may not be able to be countered, such as Lear or Sphinx of the Final Word against things like Lotus Field combo. Mystical Disputes, we've already kind of talked about. Narset's Reversal. allows you to play your opponent's key spell against them. Often this is something like Thought Distortion, but can be used to like steal your opponent's Dig Through Times and stuff, bouncing it back to their hand. You get the advantage. And then Either Gust, we've already kind of talked about its utility. This is the other version that's done well recently. A lot of the cards we've already kind of talked about. A couple other things to point out. A second copy of Sorin the Mirthless. Not quite sure how that is. 1 of seems fine. 2 might be a little bit much. Ashiok Nightmare Muse is an interesting way. Allows you to pump out a bunch of 2/3 creatures, potentially chum block your opponent or pressure them if you're on a control deck. Allows you to bounce a non-land permanent to their hand, and then they have to exile a card. If they happen to have no cards in hands, this can deal with anything basically. Shark Typhoon we've already kind of talked about. Dig Through Time. Overall, this is a very interesting deck. Erebos' Intervention, yet another card that allows you to have a little bit of, March of Endless March or something. The Black March is also very similar to this. Allows you to deal damage to a creature or planeswalker and recover some life. This is very similar, other than it gives you utility against creatures and utility against graveyard rather than just planeswalkers. Sideboard, Unmoored Ego for any type of combo nonsense. Lotus Field, potentially mono green, stripping their cards, etc. Graveyard Trespasser is an interesting change of pace against things like mono red and such, while also being a house and control mirrors if your opponent's not expecting it and they board out a bunch of their removal. Thought Distortion, Ritual of Soot, yet another conditional sweeper mono black has access to. Kalidas, Witches of Vengeance, creatures of a chosen creature type get -3/-3 until end of turn. Very good, particularly against humans and spirits. Go blank, we've already kind of talked about. Days Undoing, this is a 1-card combo with Narset to kind of lock your opponent out of the game. Effectively, you draw a new hand of 7, they draw nothing, or they draw 1 if they're lucky. And then obviously the rest of the cards we've already kind of talked about. Now, as far as where Dimir sits in the meta, obviously it's been on a little bit of an uptick lately. Having some decent finishes in the hands of Gabriel Nassif, and having some other recent finishes and some challenges. That said, Blue-White continues to be the more predominant version of Control. Basically, it's, do you want a better combo and control matchup, or do you want a better matchup against the aggressive decks? Blue-White obviously having access to the sweepers, is better suited to deal with a bunch of creatures. Blue-Black has the better spot removal and has the better overall matchup against control mirrors and combos. So if you're playing against decks like Spirits and such, Blue-Black might be a little bit better because you have more instant speed removal that's relevant. And something like Spell Queller can't come down and take your Supreme Verdict. You have access to Fatal Pushes or Eliminates or Power Word Kills to deal with those kind of things. That said, you are a little bit worse into things where your sweepers are relevant, decks like humans, decks like, mono red sometimes, having that clean Supreme Verdict sometimes is important, whereas an Extinction Event might come down, might take your opponent's, say, Torbrand and, Burning Tree Emissaries, but then leave them with, their Fervent Champions and, the 3-mana guy that's escaping my mind at the moment. But just an example where sometimes Extinction Event isn't quite the sweeper you're asking for. That said, the ability to exile is quite nice, but Supreme Verdict being uncounterable and less conditional, obviously quite nice. And then Farewell is just kind of the way to end the game against a lot of different decks, like, the Sacrifice decks cleaning up all the things they have various going on. Dimir's in a decent place in the meta. It's better if you like cleaner mana over something like Esper, which Esper kind of has the balance of having the good spot removal, having the good sweepers, having the good win cons. Dimir, obviously, you have access to a much wider variety of things. Maybe that's just because they all aren't quite as good as what Blue-White has. So, where Blue-White, the main fight is how many Supreme Verdicts, how many Farewells, and, what split of removal are you playing. With Dimir, it's, how do you juggle all of the various good removal spells you have with your sweepers and trying to piece together enough win cons to actually win the game, as you don't have access to things like the Wandering Emperor or Teferi Hero of Dominaria. Overall, I think this deck is quite decent in the meta. It can kind of go toe-to-toe with Rakdos in some ways, although Rakdos can kind of steamroll it, and it can have a little bit of a tricky matchup against mono green, but overall you can have a pretty decent game against almost anything else if you choose to. Having access to things like Cling to Dust and things like Eliminate can make the Greasefang matchup pretty reasonable. You have enough tools against humans, although they can sometimes get under you. With things like Fatal Push and Bloodchief's Thirst, you can potentially have a decent matchup against them, slowing down their early aggression and then dealing with them. And then, other decks like Spirits and such, I do think Dimir is probably a little bit better into them, simply having the better spot removal, not playing as much at sorcery speed. And a lot of your early plays are just better in terms of dealing with their creatures. Your big play as far as flash things with blue-eye control is something like Wandering Emperor, and while Dimir's threats are a little bit more tap-outy in terms of, Sorin or Ashiok versus something like the Wandering Emperor, you do have the better removal and, access to the same suite of counter spells. Overall, I do think blue-white is a slightly better deck, but, Dimir does have its place against decks like Lotus Field and against Control Mirrors. If you're seeing a lot of that in your meta, this might be a deck to consider picking up. And I do believe that Dimir is a tiny bit cheaper, although, you're still running a lot of the same expensive cards. But, if you're on a budget a little bit, Dimir might be a little bit better. Obviously, Shark Typhoons can be a bit expensive, and some of the other cards can be. But, the blue-eye control deck is a little bit more expensive because of things like Wandering Emperor, Teperia, Hero of Dominaria, etc. So it is something to be aware of. And there are quite a bit of cards in this deck that can also fit in other cards, such as the beginning stages of Rakdos, things like Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, things like Kalidas and such. So it is something to consider that it's a little bit easier to switch decks maybe if you're in Dimir than it is blue-white. But as always, if you like these deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below.